Before the sun rose over the crowded streets of Manila, before jeepneys filled the air with horns and vendors called out their first sales of the day, a man named Ernesto Santos was already awake. At 54 years old, Ernesto's body moved slower than it once had, but his routine never changed. He sat on the edge of a thin mattress in a small rented room, tying the worn laces of his black work shoes with fingers roughened by decades of labor. The mirror on the wall reflected a face carved by time and hardship, deep lines around the eyes, flecks of gray in his hair, shoulders that carried more than just physical weight. On a small wooden table beside him sat a faded photograph. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, stood barefoot on a beach, grinning widely at the camera. His eyes sparkled with innocence, his arms slung around his father's waist. Ernesto picked up the photo every morning. "Good morning, my son," he whispered. Then he placed it back gently, as if the boy could feel the touch. For Ernesto, life had split into two parts, before and after his son Mateo. Before, there had been laughter in their tiny home. Before, there had been dreams spoken aloud. Before, there had been music filling the air. After, there was silence. Mateo had been everything to Ernesto. His wife had passed away when Mateo was only 4, leaving Ernesto alone to raise a small boy with curious eyes and endless questions. Ernesto worked multiple jobs: construction, delivery, cleaning offices at night, anything to keep food on the table. It was exhausting, but every time he came home and saw Mateo waiting at the door, the tiredness melted away. Mateo loved to sing. It started when he was very young. He would hum to himself while playing with toy cars, softly mimic songs he heard on the radio, and eventually belt out melodies with surprising confidence. "Papa, listen," Mateo would say, standing on a chair like it was a stage. Ernesto would clap and laugh. "You are going to be famous one day." Mateo took those words seriously. "I want to be a singer," he said once, eyes shining. Ernesto smiled, though a small ache tugged at his heart. He knew how hard life was. Dreams didn't always come true. But he would never tell his son that. Instead, he said, "Then you must practice every day." So Mateo did. They didn't have money for lessons or instruments. But Ernesto found old karaoke tracks on a second-hand phone and played them through a tiny speaker. Every evening, after finishing homework, Mateo would sing while Ernesto cooked rice and eggs. Sometimes, Ernesto sang too. His voice wasn't trained. It was rough, shaped by years of shouting over construction noise and breathing dust. But it was full of emotion. Mateo loved hearing his father sing. "You should be the singer, Papa," Mateo once said. Ernesto laughed. "No, that is your dream, not mine." But secretly, music had always lived inside Ernesto. As a teenager, he had wanted to sing. He used to stand outside small bars, listening to bands perform, imagining himself on stage. But life had other plans. His parents were poor. He left school early to work. Dreams were pushed aside to make room for survival. Mateo's dream became Ernesto's second chance. Then, one rainy evening, everything changed. Mateo had gone to buy bread from a nearby store. It was a short walk, something he had done many times before. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Ernesto began to worry. He stepped outside, calling his son's name. "Mateo, Mateo." The rain grew heavier. A neighbor came running. "There has been an accident," she said, breathless. Ernesto's world shattered in that moment. A speeding motorcycle had lost control on the wet road. Mateo never made it to the store. Ernesto did not remember screaming, but his throat burned for days. Afterward, at the hospital, he held Mateo's small, lifeless hand. "I am here, my son," he whispered. "Papa is here." But Mateo never opened his eyes again. After the funeral, Ernesto returned to an empty home. No laughter, no singing, no voice calling, "Papa." The silence was unbearable. For weeks, Ernesto barely spoke. He went to work, cleaned floors, emptied trash bins, wiped down desks, then came home and sat in the dark. People told him time would heal. But time did not heal. Time only taught him how to breathe without his son. One night, unable to sleep, Ernesto picked up Mateo's old phone. It still had recordings, videos of Mateo singing. Ernesto pressed play. Mateo's voice filled the room. Bright, pure, alive. Ernesto collapsed to his knees, clutching the phone to his chest. He cried harder than he ever had before. When the video ended, the room fell silent again. Without thinking, Ernesto began to sing. It started as a whisper, then grew louder. He sang the same song Mateo had been singing in the video. His voice cracked, tears streamed down his face. But he kept singing. For the first time since Mateo's death, Ernesto felt something other than pain. He felt connected. From that night on, Ernesto sang when he was alone. Not for an audience, not for applause. He sang for his son. At work, during late-night cleaning shifts, Ernesto sometimes hummed quietly while mopping floors. One evening, a security guard heard him. "You sing very well," the guard said. Ernesto shook his head. "No, I just sing. You should join a competition," the guard said half-jokingly. Ernesto laughed it off. "Me, on a stage? Impossible." Months later, a poster appeared near the bus stop. Auditions for an international singing competition. Open call. All ages welcome. Ernesto walked past it every day. Each time, his heart beat a little faster. He imagined Mateo's face. "I want to be a singer, Papa." One evening, Ernesto stopped in front of the poster. He stared at it for a long time. "I cannot," he whispered. But another voice inside him said, "You must. Not for fame, not for money, but to let Mateo's dream be heard." The night before auditions, Ernesto barely slept. He practiced quietly, afraid his neighbors would complain. His hands shook. "What am I doing?" he muttered. At dawn, he put on his cleanest shirt, a simple button-down with frayed cuffs. He placed Mateo's photo in his pocket. "For you," he said softly. The audition venue was huge. Bright lights, cameras, hundreds of people waiting, young singers warming up, some with coaches, some with parents. Ernesto felt invisible, a janitor among dreamers. He almost turned around. Then he felt the photograph in his pocket. He took a deep breath. When his number was called, Ernesto's legs felt like jelly. He walked onto the stage. 4 judges sat behind a long desk. Among them was Cowell, the man Ernesto had seen on television, known for brutal honesty. The lights were blinding. "Hello," Simon said. "What's your name?" "Ernesto Santos," he replied, voice trembling. "How old are you, Ernesto?" 54. "And what do you do for a living?" "I am a janitor." Some murmurs rippled through the audience. "Why did you decide to audition?" Simon asked. Ernesto swallowed. "My son," he said quietly. Simon leaned forward. "Tell me about your son." Ernesto's eyes filled with tears. He loved to sing. He wanted to be a singer. But he passed away. The room fell silent. "I sing for him," Ernesto continued. "This song is for my son." Simon nodded gently. "Take your time." Music began to play. A simple piano intro. Ernesto closed his eyes. For a moment, he wasn't on a stage. He was in his small home. Mateo was sitting on the bed, smiling. "Papa, listen." Ernesto opened his mouth. The first note floated into the air, soft, controlled, full of sorrow. His voice was not polished, not perfect, but it carried something deeper. Every word felt heavy, every note trembled with emotion. As he sang, images flashed through his mind. Mateo learning to ride a bike. Mateo laughing. Mateo singing. Ernesto's voice grew stronger. Pain turned into power. Grief turned into music. The audience began to cry. One judge wiped her eyes. Another pressed a hand to his mouth. Simon stared, unblinking. Halfway through the song, Ernesto's voice cracked. He almost stopped, but he remembered Mateo's words. "You must practice every day." He took a breath and kept going. The final note hung in the air. Silence. For 2 seconds. Then the room erupted. A standing ovation. People on their feet, clapping, cheering, crying. Ernesto stood frozen. He didn't understand. Simon stood up. His eyes were glossy. "I have heard thousands of singers," Simon said slowly. "But I have never heard pain turn into something so beautiful." Ernesto's knees nearly gave out. "That wasn't just singing," Simon continued. "That was a father's love." The other judges agreed. "You didn't come here to be famous," one said. "You came here to honor your son. And that is the most powerful reason I've ever heard." Simon leaned forward again. "Ernesto, your son would be very, very proud of you." Ernesto covered his face and sobbed. "Yes," Simon said. From me. All 4 judges said yes. Ernesto had made it through. Backstage, producers hugged him. Contestants congratulated him. But Ernesto only held Mateo's photo. I did it, my son, he whispered. That audition went viral. Millions watched. Comments flooded in from around the world. I am crying. This man's voice saved me. His son is singing through him. For the first time since Mateo's death, Ernesto did not feel alone. As the competition continued, Ernesto struggled. He still cleaned offices at night. He still lived in the same small room. But something had changed. He walked with his head a little higher. He smiled sometimes. Each week, he sang a song connected to Mateo. A lullaby, a ballad about hope, a song about letting go. Every performance moved people, not because Ernesto had a perfect voice, but because his voice was real. During one live show, Simon asked him, "What do you feel when you sing?" Ernesto answered, "I feel my son is listening." Simon nodded. So are we. Ernesto did not win the competition. But it did not matter. He had already won something greater. A recording label offered him a small contract. A charity offered to help him move into a better apartment. People sent letters. Fathers who had lost children. Mothers who had lost sons. They told Ernesto his voice helped them survive. One evening, after a small concert, Ernesto stood alone on stage. He looked up at the empty seats. "Mateo," he whispered, "I hope you can see me." In his heart, he felt warmth. Not pain, not emptiness, but love. Ernesto still worked as a janitor part-time. He said it kept him grounded. But now, he also sang at community events, hospitals, and charity shows. Every time he stepped on stage, he carried Mateo with him. People often asked, "Where do you find the strength?" Ernesto answered, "A father never stops loving his child. Even after death." Late at night, in his small apartment, Ernesto still placed Mateo's photo on the table. "Good night, my son," he said. Sometimes, he sang softly before sleeping. Not for an audience, not for fame, but for the boy who changed his life. A father's pain had turned into song. And that song traveled across the world. But more importantly, it traveled straight to heaven.